I'd like to suggest that we begin a little bit of your personal history, and
Okay.
then I'd like to understand how you transitioned from your interest in computer programming to writing novels and science fiction novels in particular, which I very much enjoyed. So let's
All right.
begin with the let's begin with the first part. Tell us a
All
little
right.
bit about
Well,
your background.
I mean, I was born at a very early age. Uh, I don't- I mean, good
This is a good start. I like this.
start. Yeah. I was born and raised in California. My father was a physicist. My mother was an electrical engineer. So I was pretty much doomed to be a nerd from the start. Although I should point out that my mom did the electrical engineering for the money. Like she was there. I mean, that was her job. It wasn't her passion. Dad is genuinely a nerd. Mom's much more into literature. So I guess you could say half literature, half science nerd is how I
Yes.
came to be. Um, I grew up reading my father's science fiction collection. He's a boomer, and so he had this bookshelf about, I don't know, 6 feet tall, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep that was just jam packed full of paperbacks from his day. So I
Wow.
grew up reading science fiction from the 50s and 60s and stuff like that. So my holy trinity are Asimov, Heinlein, and
Oh,
Clark.
yes, 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 sure.
So that's the sort of like science fiction that I grew up reading. So that's kind of like what colored me. I've always been a dork. I've always been a space dork, but also I always wanted to be a writer. Like even when I was a teenager, I was writing crappy short stories and stuff like that. And when the time came to go to college, I had to decide whether or not I wanted to go into like creative writing or the fairly new field of computer science because I'm that old.
Yeah.
Um, and so I decided I liked regular meals, so I went into computer science. And I attended UC San Diego for 4 years on a BS program for computer science, and then I ran out of money and dropped out. So you're speaking to a high school graduate. That's my highest accreditation.
Yeah.
And but at that time it was 1994, and so the software industry was just going crazy. Like if you they figured if you were clever enough to open the door, you were hired. Um, so I worked for various software companies. I enjoyed software. I really liked writing programs and computer programming in general. I'd been doing it since I was a kid. I started on my little VIC 20 writing basic programs, and then once I got into high school, I had an 8086 IBM computer, 4 kilohertz processor, and I was writing C and assembly on that. In the middle there, I worked for Sandia National Labs, which was a Department of Energy installation, and they hired me as sort of like I was 15 when they hired me as just sort of a lab assistant. And that lab actually is where I started programming computers for real because they said, well, we don't really need a lab assistant. What we need is somebody to write software to analyze the data that we're getting. And this was before Excel. This was before any spreadsheet app, anything like that. So they gave me a book that said like how to program in C, and there's a computer with a C compiler on it. Tell us when you've got that worked out, and then we'll tell you what we want you to make the computer do. And that's kind of where I got my start. So when I was in college, I was really into writing. I actually wrote a book while I was in college, an entire full-length novel. It's awful. I thank God that the internet didn't exist yet because there's no record of it out there. It's not in the internet.
How did you, let me back up just a moment though. How did
Hmm.
you make this transition from computer programming to writing? Was it because of your interest in the novels that your dad had on his bookshelf, or how did you make that? What motivated
I
you?
was always both, I guess I would say. I was a computer programmer who was a wannabe writer my whole life. So it's not like I suddenly became, a writer. I always wanted to be a writer.
Yes.
And I was writing the whole time I was programming computers. I ended up being an engineer for 25 years total. Um, but I was also always writing during that time, short stories, novels, web comics, stuff like
Yeah.
that, and
Yeah.
posting them up on my website once the internet became a thing. And The
Good.
Martian was just one of those things that I was writing, but that it really took off. And once that whole thing snowballed and became a book and a movie and everything like that, then I found myself in a position where I could write full time. So that's what I do right now.
Andy, your journey is super fascinating, and I'm really interested in how you were writing programs, but also writing novels and other fiction at the same time. Many people would think of writing programs and writing fiction as completely different, as like, polar opposites even. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, are there ways that your work in computer programming informed or inspired your writing? Are there any ways that those two overlap that might be surprising to people?
In several ways. Yeah, so for starters, being a computer geek allowed me to write software to double check my math and stuff like that. So all the orbital trajectories in the Martian are accurate. I mean, tons of spreadsheet work also, because during my career I'd gotten pretty good at Excel, and so there's all that. The technical skills to do the style of very technically accurate writing that I do were very helpful. Another thing is I've noticed that my writing style is similar to my programming style, in that when I'm designing software, I come up with the top level ideas. Okay, we're going to have this class that does that, this class that does that, this layer that does that. I'll abstract that out. I'll do this. Da, 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 da. When I'm writing, I think of I do it, and then when I'm programming, I do that, and then while I'm writing the code is when I go like, okay, now we're going to get into the specifics of the design. When I'm writing, it's fairly much the same thing. I have the top level idea of the story, but it's while I'm actually writing the story that I come up with the detail level. And oftentimes, same as in programming, when I'm implementing it, I realize there's a better way. And then like I delete what I've done and then work on something, a different approach and stuff. But I would say the main way that being an engineer has helped my writing is I'm kind of known for being extremely easy to work with, because when you have an engineer's mindset and you enter the world of literature, I mean, you're used to turning in a project and then being given a list of bugs, right? That's what you're used to as an engineer. I'm like, okay, so here's a rev of the program. And then people say like, well, here's like 150 bugs we found. You got to fix them. Okay, I'll fix them. Here's the next rev, and so on. And so when you're working with people in the publishing world, when they give you notes on your draft, you give them your first draft and they give you a bunch of notes, the programmer mindset is say like, okay, I'll fix those. And publishers are just like, wow, that writer's really easy to deal with, because
I'm sure they appreciate that a lot.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about how do you focus a lot of your work, maybe most of it, on things related to space, lunar, Mars exploration and survival.
Yeah.
That must have taken a fair amount of homework on your part to do what you needed to do to be able to write a meaningful novel. The Martians is what I'm talking about, obviously.
Sure.
I've seen it twice, Andy. I don't know if that counts for anything.
Okay, well, there you go.
I like the movie.
Yeah, tons and tons of research, tons of math, tons of prep work, everything like that. But that is the stuff that I enjoy, because space, dork, and geekery is my hobby. That's my interest. We're all good at doing the things that interest us. We're all knowledgeable in our hobbies, right? So if you're really into model railroads, you know all about model railroads. You know how to put together a landscape. You know how to do all the parts of it. If you're really good at gardening, if you really enjoy gardening, then you're going to know a lot about horticulture and stuff like that, even though you're not a professional. And I'm really into space and space travel. So I started off with much more than a layman's knowledge of that stuff because it was my hobby. And I had enough knowledge that I knew how to Google whatever I didn't know. And doing that research is fun for me. I really enjoy that stuff. So that's not even work at all. I really love the research and math part of my books. It's that pesky, writing that I have to do at some point that's unpleasant.
Well, but I mean, for example, I know that in the book you talk about producing water by essentially splitting hydrazine using a catalyst. I've forgotten which catalyst you used at the moment.
I think it was iridium.
Iridium. That's it. I think that's maybe right. Now, how did you know that chemistry? Is that something you found in your exploration of?
This is the fun part, is like when I'm doing my research is when I discover problems for Mark that I didn't realize he would have. So I didn't go into it when I started writing it. I didn't go into it with an idea of like, oh, he's going to need to make water. because I went into it with like, oh, well, this original mission was intended for 6 people. And so it would definitely have like some sort of water recycling system in play. And so he wouldn't have a problem with water, like drinkable water. But it was while I was researching, okay, what do you need to make potatoes? You need this, that, and the other thing.
Yeah.
And you also need a certain minimum soil moisture percentage. And I did the math on that. And I'm like, wow, he's going to need like 600 liters of water or something like that. And there's no way they would have brought that much. So I'm like, he's going to be short on water. How do I deal with that? And I'm like, okay, now what? So I had to come up with a solution. I'm like, how does he get the water? And so I scratched my head a bit and started thinking about, well, what does he have to work with? Bear in mind, I get to cheat a little bit because I'm the writer. So, I said like, all right, I have decided that the MDV used hydrazine fuel, same as the Apollo landers. Why not? And hydrazine fuel is, releases enormous amounts of hydrogen. And so he gets the hydrogen from that. He gets the oxygen by just collecting CO2 from Mars's atmosphere, which Mars's atmosphere is like 99% carbon dioxide. So he collects carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, runs that through the Habs oxygenator, which is made to turn exhaled carbon dioxide back into oxygen, but whatever. So then he gets a bunch of oxygen that way and the hydrogen from the hydrazine, and he can mix them to make water. Yeah. And so I was like, okay, that was an interesting little side interlude that I hadn't planned at all because I happened to notice something while researching how to grow potatoes. Like nobody would have given me any problems. Like nobody would have said anything if I just hadn't had that scene at all. Like people would have said like, okay, he brings soil in from outside and then he has potatoes. But like seeing that led down this whole rabbit hole of interesting problem solving. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious. What is NASA's reaction to that whole scenario?
They just the book. You mean they loved it?
No, I mean in particular that finding means of surviving. You need water to survive. Finding a means by being clever enough to know that you could split hydrazine, and you could take the hydrogen and react it with oxygen to produce some water. Does NASA give you any comment on that whole business?
As an entity, NASA didn't make an official comment on it, but many NASA engineers have talked to me about the book and how much they enjoyed it and stuff.
So one thing that I think is so fantastic about your work, Andy, speaking of The Martian, is that it can appeal to experts like Ron or NASA engineers or people like me who have no idea about any of this, but who find the experience of reading it just so enjoyable and so plausible in terms of the things that are happening. Going back to the research process, are you sort of always trying to sort of track recent developments that might kind of go into your science fiction? Or I'm wondering if we talk a little bit about that.
Well, not compulsively, not like, oh, I've got to keep an eye on things so that my fiction's gonna be better, but that's like an interest of mine, right? So I'm always tracking recent developments in science because I like to hear about them. And sometimes they spur story ideas or subplot ideas, of course.
I'm curious now, what do you see next? I mean, you're obviously very interested in space travel.
Of course.
But think about AI and all of the other technology evolution.
Yeah, no, I definitely I'm working on my next book now. AI plays a significant role in it, but my way, not like, robots falling in love or anything. It's like I do it my way. I mean, I'm writing a story that involves a lot of AI is kind of in my wheelhouse because I know how computers work. And I know more about machine learning than most fiction writers, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm having some fun with that. Although my writing process has been slowed down dramatically by the appearance of a child in my household that just keeps running around wanting my attention.
Yes, that would certainly be distracting.
He's 2.5 now.
Oh yes,
congratulations!
That's a good age.
Thank you. He's my little guy.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful.
Thanks.
What is your general reaction to AI? It's evolving so quickly.
It is
almost meteoric, and it is.
Yeah, but I'm not. I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom talk about it, or a lot of like, oh my God, this is going to put so many people out of work and stuff like that. I'm like, well, every new technology ends up, putting a lot of people out of work. So when it comes to new technology, I consider all technology to be a tool,
Yeah.
and AI is no different. Yeah, and a tool is a tool. What matters is how people use it. So, I mean, if you give me a hammer, I can build a house or I can murder someone, right?
Yes.
The
Yeah.
hammer itself is not the issue. It's the person who's using it. So someone could use AI to help cure cancer, or someone could use AI to develop a custom virus that only attacks an ethnicity they don't like.
I think there's a very important message in what you're saying, Andy, and that is that science and technology should be used to help people. I think that's really the essence of what you're saying, right?
Well, I mean, should be, absolutely, but I'm going a step further than that. I'm saying is. Due to human nature, science and technology generally improves the world. There are bad actors who do bad things with it, but on the whole, I mean, like I said, try to name a technology that's done more harm than good. You say
Yeah.
nuclear bombs, I say nuclear power. How much coal dust is not in the air? How much pollution and emissions are not in the air because nuclear power plants exist? How
Yeah.
many people did not die in coal mines over the past 50 years because nuclear power plants exist? You
Yeah.
know?
I'm just curious, how does a writer's mind think? How would you put what we've just been talking about into science fiction? No, seriously,
Well,
I'm very
yeah,
interested
no, I
in.
mean, for starters, in science fiction, one of the most generic plots to do in science fiction, it's done all the time, is think of a new technology, then think of the bad actors,
Yeah.
and then have them be the antagonists, and then have your protagonists out there trying to put a stop to them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, pick a technology and say what could an organized group of bad people do with this technology, and so what would the good people do to stop that?
Yeah.
And in my stories also, I tend to like, person versus nature type of stuff where there is no bad guy. There are no bad actors at all. It's just all of humanity or all of a group of people working together to try to solve a problem. Like there's no antagonist in The Martian other than Mars.
Yeah. I get you.
And I don't know if you read Project Hail Mary, my latest, but that's a non-intelligent monocellular pathogen is the main problem.
Do you see writing on topics related to some other issue, some other technology beyond space travel as part of your future?
I mean, sure. I mean, I'm not going to limit myself exclusively to space travel, but I really do love it. And it really is an exciting
Yeah.
storytelling mechanism because everything's cooler in space, right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I just admire what you've done because you've put an awful lot of interesting stuff together. And, for someone who's, I would have thought if you were a NASA engineer, maybe this would be second nature to you, but you're a computer programmer. And so
Well, like I
you
say,
put,
we're all knowledgeable at our hobbies and passions. Like I know, like my uncle Alan. It's not important you knew his name was Alan, but my uncle Alan can look at any classic car, just a photo. You show him a photo of like any classic car, and from just about any angle, and he can tell you make, model, and year. Like he's like that level of knowledgeable about cars, and that's not what he does for a living.
yeah.
He's just a gearhead. He's really into that stuff. People are very
Hmm.
knowledgeable in the things that they're passionate and excited about, and that's just again human nature.
You've got a real passion for space and space
I do.
travel.
Yeah, I
Project
think it's
Hail
awesome.
Mary, Project Hail Mary is another example, isn't it?
Yes, it
What's
is.
and what is the origin of that novel?
Well, so it's kind of interesting. Between The Martian and Artemis, I had a contract to write a book for
Yeah.
Random House. And I was writing a book that was going to be called Zhek, Z-H-E-K. And it was more of a soft science fiction. At the time I started, I was like, this is going to be my magnum opus. Like The Martian is going to be what people know me as my entry into the world. But this is going to be a book series, it's going to be like 5 books long. And it's going to be like Game of Thrones level of awesomeness and stuff like that. And I got 70,000 words into that book. For reference, The Martian is 100,000 words. I got 70,000 words into Zhek, and I realized it sucked. Like, it just wasn't good. The plot was too complicated. The characters weren't interesting. Everything was meandering around. I was still in the first act, so this was going to be some giant 600-page tome that nobody wants to read. And I'm like, this is not the way forward. I ended up bailing out of that project, asking Random House very, very nicely for an extension, and asking if I could write a completely different book instead. And they said yes, because they had been reading the pages I'd been making, and they also agreed that it sucked. And so then I went on to write Artemis, which I'm really glad that I did. But Jacques had in it a few really good ideas, like that I feel like. So it's like a big pile of garbage with a couple of diamonds in it, And so I plucked those ideas out and I recycled them into Project Hail Mary. And one of them is a mass conversion based fuel. I thought in Project Hail Mary, it was a technology called black matter. And what it would do is black matter would just absorb any electromagnetic radiation. That's why it was black, because it didn't reflect anything, and turn that energy into mass in the form of black matter. So if you had a little bit of black matter, you could get more and more, right? And then it could release that in the form of gamma rays whenever you wanted, and you could use that as propulsion, because light can be used for propulsion if you have enough of it. Okay, and that's mass conversion as a fuel source. And I thought about, oh man, why don't I just start with that? That was really cool. Why don't I start with that? But what about if people modern day had this fuel? So not in some distant, complicated future, but right now. What if we invented black matter right now? First thing I was thinking is like, wow, we could colonize the solar system really easily. I mean, it's basically a perfect battery source. Life on Earth would get a lot better. Energy transportation would be easy. There'd be no power grid issues anywhere. Developing nations could have a developed nation like the United States could drop off a package this big, which could power a developing nation for years, their entire power grid. It would be like tremendous benefits. I'm like, that's cool. And space, we could explore the solar system, we could colonize Mars, the moon, everything. It'd be very easy if we had this technology. But I don't see any way that we invent this technology in the modern day. And I don't want to make a story that takes place like 300 years in the future. So how can I make this happen today? All right, option number one, we find some on an alien vessel or something that crashed on Earth, millions of years ago or something. That might work. It's a little unsatisfying. It's sort of a bullshit way to introduce a technology. I mean, it's a trope, right? It's been done. And another thing is I'm like, okay, what if scientists on Earth invent it? And I'm like, nah, that's just way too. Even if I create a Dr. Emmett Brown equivalent genius scientist, it's still too much for plausibility that one guy just comes up with this, right? And so I said, like, well, what if some ended up in our solar system, not like via an alien ship, but we just find some on the surface of a planet somewhere or something. We don't know where it comes from. Well, then everybody reading the book is going to want to know where it came from. And I'm like, what is this stuff anyway? What is black matter? How does it even work? And I'm like, well, it takes energy and makes more of itself. So that sounds like a life form. And I'm like, okay, so what if I make that just a life form? It's a life form that collects enormous amounts of energy. Why? Oh, because it's interstellar. It's basically mold that grows on stars, on the surface of stars, and then spores out in all directions to try to seed to other stars. It doesn't have an agenda or anything. It's literally just mold that spores. Okay. And then so that's why it exists. That's why it has to store up so much energy, because it uses that light energy to travel from one star to another. Yeah, this all makes sense. And I'm like, let's say we acquired some of that, and then we started using it as a fuel source. In the back of my head, I was like, oh, we'd have to make sure none of that got into our star, because that'd be disastrous. It would breed out of control. And then like one Mississippi, two Mississippi. Okay, wait, no, that's the story. That's the story.
How do you plan your day when you're working? I mean, do you work late at night? Do you get up early and work in the morning? What's your typical work schedule when you're writing?
Lately, it's very chaotic because of the baby or toddler. But a typical work day for me is I get up in the morning after I've had my breakfast and stuff like that. I'll generally spend the morning hours dealing with non-writing work-related stuff. So I answer all fan mail. Doing like I always have like multiple deals kind of floating in the air on whether or not this is going to happen or that's going to happen. So answering email, doing work related emails between me and my agent, me and my film agent, or talking directly to companies, or scheduling. I don't have a personal assistant or anything, so it's all just me. And so that sort of stuff is my maintenance kind of work stuff. Then also research, I'll do some of that. Then after lunch is when I try to do my writing. And when I'm working on a first draft, when I'm really, nose to the grindstone, I give myself an objective of 1,000 words a day, into the draft. And so I try to get 1,000 words done per day. And I kind of self-enforce that by giving myself a list of things that I cannot do until I've made my words. So like, I'm an amateur woodworker, metal machinist. Like that's one of my hobbies. I got a workshop for all that. I'm not allowed to do any of that fun stuff until I've made my words for the day. I'm also not allowed to watch any form of video entertainment. No YouTube, no movies, no TV, no nothing. There are certain websites I go to where I just like zone out and waste my time looking at stuff on those websites. They're completely non-productive and have nothing to do with work. Not allowed to go to those.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
The Martian was turned into a movie starring Matt Damon, which Ron and I are a big fan of. And as I understand it, Project Hail Mary is slated to be turned into a movie starring Ryan Gosling. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, like what's it like seeing your book turned into a movie? What are some things you are, I guess, hoping a movie gets right, or that you're thinking about when a movie that's based on your book is made and goes out into the world?
Well, it depends on what role you have to play in the movie production. So on The Martian, all they bought the rights and said bye-bye, right? So my only job was to cash the check. I didn't have any say in anything. They chose to include me just to get my input, but it was like non-binding, and they also used me sort of as a technical expert. Like they'd say, oh, what's could Mark do this on the surface? And I'm like, no, that wouldn't work, and you could do this instead and stuff. So I was used like that, just sort of as an advisor, but they definitely didn't have to pay attention to anything I said. So also that also meant that I got to read the screenplay in advance. I saw the rushes in advance and stuff like that. So nothing was really a surprise to me. The Martian was also a very true adaptation. I mean, it follows the book very closely. There's a lot of stuff that got cut because it'd be 6 hours long if everything that happened in the book happens in the movie. But the stuff that they cut is stuff that I would have cut if it had been up to me, which it wasn't. And Project Hail Mary is a different matter. I'm actually a producer on that. Now, the reason I'm a producer on it is because when I put the rights up for sale, the book was selling very well. There's already one movie obviously made out of my books that made a lot of money, so studios were very interested. And so I said, well, this time I want gross participation, which means I want a percentage of the ticket sales, like it's not quite ticket sales, but it's like of the not points on the net, which is always zero the way Hollywood accounting goes, but I want a percentage of the money that the movie makes. And most of the studios said, like, we don't do that for writers. But MGM said, we don't do that for writers, but we do it for producers, so we'll make you a producer. So we can do that. So we can give you what you want so we can get the rights to this. And I said, sounds great. I'll stay in the background and stay out of the way of the real producers who are actually knowing what they're doing. So I am technically a producer on this, which is interesting because it means like they had to get my approval to cast Ryan Gosling. I was like, yes. And so, which is funny. So, but this time I do have a little bit of sway, which is interesting. I've seen the screenplays. I've seen the rest of the screenplay. They look very good to me. I'm pretty excited about how this is going to go. Yeah.
Is there a projected time date by which it'll be released, or is that still up in the air?
No idea on release. Studios make those decisions strategically based on what other movies are coming out on which weeks and what parts of the year and so on. They don't like, so for instance, when The Martian came out, it was 2015. And The Force Awakens came out in 2015. So they were like, we don't want to be competing with The Force Awakens, right? So they were like, okay, we're going to release The Martian in October. So we have 2 months of sci-fi fans, before The Force Awakens came out in December, and so on. So that's always very strategic. So it'll depend a lot on probably the 2026 movie season. We're starting, supposedly we're going to start shooting in June of this year. So that's the current plan. So I would expect it to come out in 5, not 26. Sorry, I meant 25. I would expect it to come out in 25. When exactly it comes out, or even what season it comes out, will depend a lot on what other films are coming out and when.
Very exciting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
You know, on a slightly different topic, but still related to space, there's a great deal of interest in the materials community on asteroid mining. Have you spent any time looking into that, Andy?
I have, but I always end up coming up with the same answer so all unlocking our solar system to humanity really depends on dramatically driving down the cost to low Earth orbit. Everything hinges on that. So
Yes.
Companies like SpaceX and Boeing and less and other companies that are doing the same thing are competing to try to drive that price down. And that, I think, is the key, because as it sits, the cost of sending something to an asteroid, harvesting materials and coming back to Earth, it doesn't even matter what those materials are. It's going to be cheaper just to find them on Earth. So there's nothing that asteroids have that Earth doesn't have. It's just that
there is another dimension, though, and that is that some of these materials are critical materials, and they're not available uniformly across the Earth, and so there is a concern
right. But
about.
then you start running into things like market forces. Like if rare earth materials, for instance, start becoming really difficult to attain, and we're not able to make the batteries we need, then probably what will happen is people will invent new kinds of batteries that don't require them.
That's probably
rather
right.
than an entire economy developing where you go into the asteroid belt to get those rare earths. Or let me put it another way. If you used plan B where you go out into space to get those rare earths and the technology relied on that, then your iPhone would cost $50,000 because the minerals used to make your battery required a freaking space mission.
Point well taken, Andy. That's a good point. You know, I think this has been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this tremendously, and I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Andy, thank you very, very much again. I can't tell you how much we both enjoyed this, and I'm sure our readers and viewers will too. So thank you, sir, for
thank you
being a part of this
Andy.
conversation today.
Well, thanks for having me.